Can I say on this evening, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be present at this birthday celebration and present this special miner's lamp to someone like Ewan MacColl, who has made an outstanding contribution, not only to folk music, but to the working class movement.
Ewan MacColl, writer, composer, actor, playwright, folk singer, agitator, romantic and Stalinist, celebrated his 70th birthday this year. Folk fans, refugees from the singing 60s, striking miners, reformed hippies and retired revolutionaries gathered to pay tribute to the daddy of the folk revival.
Come all you gallant drivers, wherever you may be, whether you drive or you played or a 54 RP, keep your hand upon the leafer's cut and fill a steady load. And take it nice and steady, boys, digging up the road. We built 100 airfields in the...
Here in the Singers Club, London, which he runs with his wife Peggy Seeger and their family, in a fundraising concert for striking shipyard workers in Liverpool, and in a birthday gala performance in the Royal Festival Hall, Ewan MacColl looks back in words and music on 70 years of struggle against bosses, blacklegs, policemen, and the unmusical.
Now we're going nice and steady, boys, digging up the road.
Well, both my parents were Scots. My father came from Stirlingshire, my mother from Perthshire, from Achterarder. They were working people, but both of them sang. Both of them had good repertories of traditional songs, and a lot of other songs too, you know, music hall and street songs and so on. My father was the son of an iron moulder. He himself was an iron moulder. His grandfather had been an iron moulder. And of course he grew up in that part of Scotland which is the classic soil of the iron industry. And round about that time he fell under the influence of John Maclean, who was the great Scottish revolutionary leader, a friend of Lenin's, a protege of Lenin's in actual fact. He would come home from work on a Saturday, and he would sit there, after he'd had his meal, he would sit there in his moleskins, his moleskin trousers, with his galluses, his braces looped down, with his feet up on the hob. And he'd usually had a few drinks, and he would sing and whistle.
My old man was a good old man, skilled at the moulding trade. In the stinking heat of the iron foundry, my old man was made. Down on his knees in the moulding sand, he wore his trade like a company brand. One of the Cyclops' smoky band, yes, that was my old man. My old man wasn't really old, it was just that I was young. And anybody over 12 years old was halfway to the tomb. He was loyal to his workmates all his life, gave his pay packet to his wife, had a few jars on a Saturday night, yes, that was my old man. My old man was a union man, fought hard all his days. He understood the system and was wise to the boss's ways. He said, if you want what's yours by right, you'll have to struggle with all your might. They'll rob you blind if you don't fight, son, that was my old man. My old man was was a proud old man at home on the foundry floor, until the day they paid him off and showed him to the door. They gave him his card, said things are slack, and we've got a machine can learn the knack of doing your job, so don't come back. The end of my old man. My old man, he was 51. What was he to do? A craftsman moulder on the dole in 1932. He felt he'd given what he could give, so he did what thousands of others did. Abandoned hope and the will to live, they killed him, my old man. My old man, he is dead and gone. Now I am your old man. And my advice to you, my son, is to fight back while you can. Watch out for the man with a silicon chip. Hold on to your job with a good firm grip. 'Cause if you don't, you'll have had your chips the same as my old man.
Blacklisted in Scotland, MacColl's father moved the family to Salford, Lancashire, where Ewan went to school, and his father found a different means of self-education.
He used to go along to a place in Salford that we used to go to called Heineman Hall, later called the Workers' Arts Club. And this Workers' Arts Club had a snooker table on the first floor and a bar. On the second floor, it had a little dance hall, and on the third floor, it had a boxing ring, the Workers' Arts Club. And he would go there, and he'd stand at the bar, and he'd sing a song like the Dowie Dens of Yarrow, 14 or 15 verses, and the snooker players would stop playing, and there'd be no longer the click of balls when he sang, you know. And this is a ballad dealing with a 17th century incident in a place that had no more than a dozen inhabitants, you know.
Can you remember any of it?
Oh, yeah. It went. There was a lady in the north, I ne'er could find her marrow. She was courted by 9 gentlemen and a blue boy lad frae Yarrow. And so on. Long, slow ballad. And he'd captured them completely. My father wasn't only interested in singing, however, in the trade union movement, but he was interested in politics in a really profound way. And he wasn't the only one of this particular group. They represent a kind of small, perhaps very narrow community that has ceased to exist. They were the last remnants, I suppose, of that, of the kind of working men who were produced in the final days of the first industrial revolution, and of that great political revolution which followed on the Industrial Revolution, which started in 1848 and went on building up, which produced the Chartist movement in Britain, and later produced the great series of working class movements. And I've already said that he was brought into politics, so to speak, by John Maclean, but he went on reading, he went on exploring ideas right until the last days of his life. And when I was a young fellow, when I was, say, 14 or 15, I used to go along to the Workers' Arts Club, and even earlier too. And there would be a circle of men that would include my father. Old men, I thought of them at that time. They were men in their 40s and 50s. And Jock Smiley, and Jack Williams, and Jimmy Tilbrook, and Bill Savage, and a whole lot of others. And they'd sit there with their pint mugs in their hand, and 2/3 of them unemployed, and they'd sit and they'd argue. They'd argue philosophical points. Somebody would bring a volume of Dietzkin or a Feuerbach and somebody had read Engel's Anti-Feuerbach, and they would argue by the hour about these things, you know. And it was perhaps no accident that when my father brought me books from the second-hand bookstalls, that there were books like Haeckel's Riddle of the Universe and Darwin's Descent of Man and so on. And they also numbered among their ranks people who could quote passages from Robert Ingersoll's books. Ingersoll, of course, was the great kind of American rationalist writer. They argued about Tom Paine, as though Tom Paine was a kind of contemporary of theirs. One of them was constantly bringing up passages from Volney's Ruins of Empires. Volney was the historian to Napoleon I. These were a brand of working class intellectual that was interested in all kinds of things. So that too was part of my background. So on the one hand, I was fortunate in growing up in a family where there still existed, even in the heart of this gigantic slum, where there still existed a real living folk culture on the one hand, and also a realization that politics was important to us. Politics was absolutely central to our lives. This is what my father always taught, you know. People who were not interested in politics, my father he dismissed as just one of evolution's failures, he would say. Just one of evolution's failures. He applied this to policemen, scabs, and people uninterested in politics.
And by politics, he meant communism.
He meant his politics. Yes, I suppose he meant communism. Now, my mother, she came south from her part of Scotland too. She worked at various jobs for a time. She was a maid in a minister's house in Glasgow. During periods when my father was unemployed, my old lady would take in washing, and the house was always filled with the smell of hot linen and of wash tubs, so that I would come home from school. I must have been 5 or 6 or 7 about this period. I remember coming home in the autumn or the winter period and going in, and she'd obviously been ironing a long time. She was standing there in our kitchen at the table ironing, and the light had gone, and she hadn't bothered to light the gas, but there was enough light from the fire, and she's standing in the firelight, and the iron is going monotonously backward and forward, and her voice is there matching it, you know, singing songs like the brewer's daughter, for example. Or one that I remember particularly she always used to sing when she was ironing was Far out yon hills where heather grows, I met a lass we had lambs and ewes. The lambs came friskling o'er the knowes, and the moon was shining clearly o'er. And it was a very hypnotic tune, and it captured my imagination. And although I never was conscious of learning it, I found I knew the song when later on in life, when somebody called the title to mind. I thought, I know that song. Sure enough, I knew it right through. And the same with the brewer's daughter, that one that I sang the other night. That how's it go? I've forgotten it. A brewer's daughter who lived near, as true a story as you shall hear. Up to London she has gone to look for service, and she's found one. You know, if I just sing that stanza, I can recall the smell of hot linen. It's a very singular smell.
What's that other one that we were doing?
Was it the?
Yeah.
Was it the windy wall? Was it the windy wall? A bonny wee laddie we cuddly left to tack her merry along.
My mother had a remarkably true voice. That is, she could keep pitch over long, long periods of time. Even when she got old, she managed to be able to always to sing in pitch.
Lovely day.
Pete Seeger, around about 1971, when we were visiting his home in Beacon in New York, made a home movie of her singing. And again, she never loses pitch. Her voice is a bit quavery, it's weak, but it's still absolutely pure, still true.
And then the Disney light gets scorched and gang to the deal for me.
My relationship with Salford, ever since I left, has been a love-hate one. I can't bear the place, the idea of going back there. And at the same time, everything I do, everything I've ever written, is to some extent informed by my experience in Salford. We were poor because we grew up in a landscape where everything offended the eye. The houses were unending lines, when I lived in them, of blackened brick, 2 up and 2 downs, facing each other across 28 feet of cobbles. One street was exactly like the one next to it and the one next to that, and so on. 2 streets away from us was the Irwell, where if you fell in the Irwell, you didn't drown, you were poisoned. This was the local kind of folklore. On the bottom of our street, or the street which was the continuation of our street, was the canal. The canal was a kind of a quiet, oleaginous kind of sump for the town, with a scum of coloured oil and grease, dead dogs floating upside down. Occasionally the police would come and the kids would climb the wall to the canal if they could get there without being seen, and lie and watch the police drag their grappling irons and fetch a suicide out, you know. It was that kind of a place. On the other side, you could walk along the canal bank, and on the other side, it was lined with factories which had been built around about the 1780s, 1790s, a glassworks, a small mill, a finishing mill, a bleaching place, and all giving off their own individual smells. This is the thing I remember most about Salford. Every area had its smell. For instance, that Regent Road area where the cattle market was situated, you closed your eyes. You didn't need to be told you were there. You could smell the pigs and you could smell the cattle, you know. And I learned, I walked Salford from the time I was 14 to the time I was 18, I would guess. And a lot of the time I did this with a mate of mine, a fellow called Bob Goodman, who lived in Briggs Street in Salford. Bob and I used to walk around the town, and we'd say, that's the place where Engels mentions in that letter to Marx that he wrote on October the 13th, 1874, or whatever, you know. Say, no, and we have an argument about this. Are we walking through Ardwick? You say, oh, that's the mill that's mentioned in the condition of the working class in England, 1834. That's the one that he says about so-and-so. So in a way, not only was Salford and Manchester ours, in the sense that we knew its history, and we knew its working class history in particular, but also Engels was ours. He was a buddy, he was a mate. We loved old Friedrich, you know, because he walked the same streets that we'd walked. He'd looked on the same factories and the same mills that we were looking at, you know, knew the same kind of people. And when we discovered, we became kind of, very, very ardent ramblers, hikers and rock climbers, Bob and I. And when we learned that Engels used to take his girlfriend, Kitty O'Shea, to stay at a little place just outside Marple, you can't believe how excited we were, you know, at this. Here was one of the great philosophers of the 19th century, and he was our mate, and did the kind of things that we did, you know. So that, as I say, that in spite of the poverty of the surroundings, in spite of the bleakness of Salford itself, there was a kind of life in us that made us impervious to these things in a way. I used to walk down when I was about 15 and 16, and kind of with the special kind of loneliness that a male adolescent has for women, for girls, you know, when all your thoughts are of girls. When you walk around all the time in a kind of daze, imagining the things that could happen to you and that never happened to you. I'd walk through Salford at night, on a moonlight night, and see the moon reflected on the grey slates. They looked like pewter, like polished pewter, and the moon kind of rising above the city, down Silk Street with its, past the Boots's factory, and then past the, on the other side of the mill, road, a derelict mill, kind of half vandalized, and so on, right down, and up, then through rows and rows of the kind of houses I lived in. And you could literally feel the sleep in those houses. You could feel, it was palpable. And I used to think, Jesus Christ, all these places filled with people like me, dreaming, you know. Why do we put up with it? Why do they put it? And I used to think that all these books I'm reading, I used to go to the library and I used to think, I'm going to write Balzac and Dostoevsky into my name, you know. And Salford was my Paris. It was, and the unemployed blokes I know, this one was Rastignac, and that one was Lucien de Rupombre. All the characters out of the human comedy, I saw as the people I was meeting every day on the streets of Salford.
I met my girl on the gasworks grow. Dreamed a dream by the old canal. Kissed my girl by the factory wall. Dirty old town, dirty old town.
Heard a siren from the door. Saw a train set the night on fire. Smell the spring on the smoky wind.
Dirty old town, dirty old town. Clouds are drifting across the moon. Cats are prowling on that beat. Springs a girl in the street at night. Dirty old town, dirty old town. Shining steel, tempered in the fire, will chop you down like an old dead tree. Dirty old town, dirty old town.
After the general strike, my father was in and out of work pretty much all the time. And consequently, my mother had to go out working for a period, and for a period we took in lodgers. And I can remember a long succession of lodgers. But one of them, a fellow called Charlie Harrison, who came to live with us, made a very deep impression on me. He was a very ascetic bloke. And every day I used to have to go out and buy 4 ounces of Cheshire cheese and a small Hovis loaf, and he lived on that. That was his diet. And he wouldn't take any of the things my mother offered him. God knows we were poor. We were really on the edge all the time. But no, he wouldn't. He'd set himself a regimen of this. But he was there around about the time I was coming up to leave school. I left school on the day I was 14. No, the week I was 14. I was 14 on the Tuesday and I left on the Friday. But anyway, Charlie's, he was mad on opera. And he had an old wind-up gramophone. And the only luxury allowed himself was a Saturday morning when he would play the whole of Pagliacci right through on these old Columbia 78 discs, you know. And I learned the whole of that opera. And I used to do cod versions of it to all my mates, you know. This evening at 7 o'clock I invite you to see our performance. I know 'twill delight you. We'll show you the troubles of poor Punchinello and the vengeance he wreaked on a treacherous fellow. Antonio the clown with his big corporation, that strange combination of love and of hate. So come then and honor us, we'll all be delighted. At 7 you're invited, at 7 we're invited. We'll all be delighted. Say, will you drink with me a measure? They sell good liquor at the tavern yonder. And so on. I'd sing all the parts, you see. And Charlie heard me doing this, and he may have been a little incensed, I don't know, but he says, you know, you're a good mimic. You ought to be doing theatre work.
The Red Megaphones was the first of a varied clutch of street theatre groups in which the young MacColl played out the coming revolution.
The idea was that we would write our own sketches, or we would take sketches from anybody who had suitable material, and we would perform wherever there was a flat space on which to stand. And this meant we were available for performing in the streets, if we were allowed to perform in the streets, or in public parks, or wherever, you know. And then we did one on Mirut, which we didn't write, but we got from we affiliated, that's right, to the WTM, the Workers' Theatre Movement. And they sent a script on Mirut, which was about the strike of the Gerni Kamgar Railway Union in India in 1931, I think it was. And the leaders of that strike were imprisoned and given ferocious sentences, life sentences in some place. And this sketch that we had was absolutely perfectly suited to street theatre. It could be performed by 4 or 6 people. And we all, by this time, were wearing the same kind of uniform, that is brown khaki shirts and bib and brace overalls. We were based on the German blue blouse groups, and there were many of them, and they were very powerful, and they were very skillful and all the rest of it. We were not skillful, and there weren't many of us. But we were a blue blouse group. And all you needed for Mirut were 4 poles. Broom handles would do. And, no, not 4. Yes, 4 poles. And you would go to the place where you were going to perform, and 2 of you would kneel down, and you would put the poles vertically in front of you, holding them like that. The other 2 would have them at the horizontal, so that they'd form prison bars. And you started the thing. It was a mass declamation. India, everybody would say. In every state in British India, the police and troops are out to crush the rising tide of revolt against the vile conditions. Voice. India, the brightest jewel in Britain's crown. And so it went on, you know, finishing with hands across the sea. And everybody would put their hands through the bars. It was a plea for international solidarity. Hiking was the great sport of young workers in the north of England in that period. And young unemployed in particular, who had to sign on maybe twice a week, could go out for 3 and 4 days at a time and live really cheaply off the land and off what they could lift, you know, in the way of potatoes, grouse that they could take from the moors in the season and so on. And Unfortunately, the great areas of Derbyshire that were the best for walking, that is the High Peak, the Kinder area and Bleaklow Moors, were and are privately owned, although these days, of course, there's routes across them. But at that time, if you dared to go onto the moors, you were liable for imprisonment and so on. So, but we did go on. We went every week. Great masses of people went on every week and spent their time dodging keepers and all the rest. Occasionally they'd be assaulted and beaten up. Occasionally they'd go to court and have to pay heavy fines. Well, we wanted the thing clarified. We wanted access to those moors. So we organized a mass trespass. I remember on for that particular campaign, I was the publicity organizer. And I remember writing in longhand, laborious letters. We are having a mass trespass. You're welcome to come and, take pictures. And the day arrived, and to our absolute astonishment, about 3,000 hikers turned up. And it was a wonderful sight at Hayfield to see all these young kids, of whom I was one, people from between the ages of 15 and maybe 25. All in their hiking gear with rucksacks or their burgers on their backs and climbing, heavy boots on, and shorts, making their way in a great column up to Kinder, and then up over Ashop Head. Well, there was a line of keepers about every 5 yards along the first ridge with sticks. And we got there, and we formed a small kind of arrowhead and just went right through them, and they closed in, but there were more of us coming up behind. We closed on them. And then there was a running fight went on, but we actually got across. The upshot of it was that for the rest of the day, as soon as we got down onto the roads, the police were there in huge numbers. They brought them from South Derbyshire, from places like Derby. They brought from the Nottinghamshire, from Leicester, and North Yorkshire, all over the place. And they had some of them with big African boarhounds, I remember, that were there to terrify us, And indeed, they did. And they arrested half a dozen, and they were sentenced to sentences ranging, I think, from 18 months to 5 months. I'm not absolutely sure about that. But it was a tremendous struggle, and indeed, as a result of that struggle, the access to mountains was brought forward years. I think that mass trespass did more to bring access to mountains than the 100 years of speech-making had done.
Let's try the chorus first. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all my pleasure the hard moorland way. I may be a wage slave on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. I've been over Snowdon, I've slept up on Crowdon, I've camped by the Wainstones as well. I've sunbathed on Kinder, been burned to a cinder, and many more things I can tell. My rucksack has off been my pillow, the heather has off been my bed, and sooner than part from the mountains, I think I would rather be dead. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all my pleasure the hard moorland way. I may